Always you're okay?
That's perfect. Thanks, man. Appreciate it. All right. Chalk. Oh, man. Okay. Everything good? Doing okay today, everybody?
Yep.
All right, you ready for rock? You ready to go? Rock and roll. Get to that. Rock and roll still back. See that? Really? Really? I didn't see you, John. It wasn't John.
Yeah.
I remember they had the
Crazy, I just saw it.
last time. First time, the first ever person I think was a hurricane. Back it's the funniest thing was Thursday. I know, I mean, it was just like this, it was like early, it's first of the season and I didn't, you know, I'm not gonna take this one with that. It just didn't strike me as like football weather. It was like 20 degrees outside. It's just, I mean, yeah, I had the stupid officer who used to go out by 3 in the afternoon, like, the walks were full. The game wasn't even here. We're out there partying, and this, you know, dudes who bring in got the ambulances, filled with ice full of shit, I guess. I don't know, it was just, it was hilarious. I'm like, dude, what's going on? I didn't know how the game was starting, you know. It's kind of funny. Okay, you guys don't want to listen to me. You have to listen to me. You don't want to listen to me. But we gotta go. This is good stuff now. We got really good. So we're gonna just practice some stuff today. Now there's a lot of extra stuff online and available to help out. So there's a whole thing next week. Oh, wait a minute. The first thing is like I understand there's a lot of people that are pissed off at me. I'm sorry about that. I just want to explain my concept of fairness, okay? So the point is approximately 2/3 of the class got the quiz done by the last time. I really do apologize that we did. But you know, 2/3 did. So it's to me, it's just unfair to change the rules for everybody at that point in time. That's just my concept of fairness, right? So that's why I didn't extend, even though I really thought about it a lot. Because I was getting a lot of emails. I do appreciate you actually. And I thought about it. So extending the deadline. But I just, you know, because a lot of people had done it at the time, I just, you know, I just felt like I should. So that was my reasoning. And you know, there is the one thing we'll always do, there's plenty of opportunities for you to make that up. So it's not like not taking that quiz should be harmful necessarily. If you never, and so there's going to be 8 quiz for sure. There's only 7 that are counted. The 8th quiz always will displace the lowest grade, including a quiz you didn't take. So just make sure to take the other 6 that are required, right? And the 8th one, and then you can have full credit for all the quizzes, right? Or at least full potential credit. There is also going to be extra credit, I guarantee it, between now and the end. And the extra credit is not hard; it never is hard. You know, maybe write a paragraph or something like that, or a particular thing. Turn it in, and it has to make some sense relative to what we've been talking about in class. But that's not a hard thing to do. So there's lots of opportunity to just get extra points that easily more than they got for that, right? So that's available. Okay, so that was my logic. All right. I do appreciate people emailing me about it. So feel free to just keep emailing. All right. Even if you don't like my logic and logic, it's fine. You know. Okay. Now, there's a homework due next week, and we'll go through price elasticity thing we'll have to do today for that homework. And there's also some stuff online for that, which was up there last year because everything was online, and it was hopefully helpful. But that's still up there, so please go look at that if you haven't had elasticity concept. Okay, so we use that. You don't have to. There's no requirement to review those materials online. It's just a couple videos from other people who explain the concept of elasticity. Probably do it better than me, so you might know whether those are shit or not. And a couple other examples, tests, tests, just examples where you can try your hand at calculating some things. Right? So, all right. So we're going to talk about what affects the future growth of energy use, focusing on population demography, economic growth, and development. All right. So how's that here? This seems to have nuts. You don't have any questions or comments?
So for the homework, we have to create like graphs, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's also, some graphing tutorial on there as well. If you have a graph in Excel. So that is accurate. If you haven't graphed in Excel, that's a good point. Thanks for bringing that up. So just see that goes down. If you haven't done any graphing in Excel, so just one of the things that's changed over time is people seem to be more familiar with Excel and using it over time. So I've kind of got more comfortable just ignoring talking about it because people see, but then again, not everybody has. So if you haven't done graphing in Excel, there's some material on there that can help you sort of learn how to do that. So last year's TA created a nice tutorial for how to do just simple graphs in Excel. So go look at that if you're struggling with that. Thomas can help. I can help, right? I don't have any problem if you say, hey, I got to meet with you to learn how to do some graphing. That's fine. We can walk through that. Okay, so one of us can help out or the tutorial, whatever's easiest for you. All right. The tutorial is going to be there at 3 in the morning. If you're working on 3 in the morning, Thomas might meet you at 3 in the morning, but I'm unlikely to do that. I'll meet you at 5 in the morning. That's fine. But not 3. Okay. All right. So good. There's any other questions? Okay. All right, great. Boom, that's the outline. So we need to understand 2 things. So the way we kind of construct the beginning of the class is to kind of understand the demand side of the energy sector. From my perspective, I think Bruce's perspective, the demand side isn't so interesting as the supply side, actually. So the supply side is, what are the energy sources like coal, natural gas, oil, solar, wind, et cetera, et cetera. So we spend most of the time on supply, but we do need to understand something about demand. And actually, depending on your careers, some of you might actually really use some of this stuff. Okay. So we're going to learn about 2 things with the demand function, why it's really important for helping us sort of conceptualize what might be happening in the energy sector. One is sort of shifts along the demand curve. Those are caused by changes in supply. So this is kind of a supply and demand function from economics. And if you're familiar with economics, we put sort of quantity on the x-axis, price on the y-axis, and then we plot out demand curves as downward sloping, meaning that there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity. So if we want to get consumers to consume more of a good, what do we have to do? You have to lower the price, right? So we understand intuitively how markets work, and the demand function just is kind of reflecting that, right? In a sense, it's reflecting the fact that if we want to get these consumers who are the demanders to consume more of something, we have to lower the price. So there's kind of an inverse relationship between price and quantity. It's reflected in a downward sloping demand function. All right. So if we're moving along this thing, along any one of these demand functions, then the reason we move along is because supply shifted. That's hugely important in the energy sector. I mean, 90% of what happens in the energy sector is a function of the supply shocks. And right now, what are we doing? We're kind of experiencing maybe the aftermath of this massive hurricane that blew through, right? And it took a big chunk of the oil sector offline. The big chunk of it happens to be where the thing blew through in the Gulf of Mexico, right? So that affects the supply function for oil and maybe gasoline. So it kind of shift that around and cause the price of oil or gasoline to change, increase or decrease, right? Okay, so that's kind of a shift along the demand function. We gotta understand something. We want to learn a little bit about that. There's also shifts in the demand curve, and those are important as well. And that means that you start out here with this demand curve, and you kind of shift it out. That happens because why? It happens because population grows, income grows, right? If we go through a recession, this thing can shift in, right? Income can go down. You maybe demand less of stuff as a result of, say, a recession, right? So we need to think about the things that will shift along the demand function and maybe cause that thing to shift out. All of them are important for the energy sector, right? So we want to talk through those, understand a little bit more. Okay, here. Okay, now, some of you have had a lot of economics, some of you haven't. We're going to do this, I think, and we've done it a lot of times in this class, very successfully, that even for people who haven't had a lot of economics, we're not trying to get into so many details that you're going to become some perfect economist. I'm not trying to get that out of you, but there are a few things here about these relationships that actually are important, I think, to the energy sector. So that's where we're going to try to focus. All right. Okay, so shifts along the demand curve. That's where we're going to start right now. What causes them? Supply function shocks, if you will. So let's do this by example. All right. So U.S. gasoline consumption is around. That's still actually accurate. I left last year's prices up there just so we can feel bad about ourselves. Usually I change this every year. I got lazy this year, but I thought, yeah, it'd be interesting just to see the old prices from last year. But what is also interesting is this number hasn't changed a lot, right? It's been about the same for a decade almost. So that's our sort of current sort of consumption. That's sort of this point for this SO, the supply function. Zero, if you will, the current supply function, that's what the SO is, right? So quantity, this is going to be 390 million, right? And $2.20 per gallon is the price, right? So quantity on the x-axis, this is 390. Sorry, you can't see that. Price is up here, okay? So suppose that supply falls by 10% to 350, right? So the supply function has to shift in. This goes down, quantity goes to 390, this would say 350 right here. All right. And you're putting these two things together, you can see when this happens that okay, quantity went down, the price had to go up, right? So the amount of stuff that I have out there goes down, the quantity goes down, the supply goes down, right? So I guess I'm assuming everybody kind of intuitively gets that, right? Based on your own experience, I assume. Right? But graphically, we can see it look like this. So the question here is, suppose it falls by 10%. What happens to price? Can we figure that out? Okay, price goes up, but what actually happens to price? How much does it go up? We'll figure that out. Let's back up for a second. Who would give a crap about that? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, you would care. Aside from who else would care? Yeah.
Any oil company,
The oil company would care. Why?
because that's how much money they're making on the gallon, or how much they can sell it for.
Okay. All right. Yep.
People that have to ship stuff at certain rates, like for effective job,
People are moving it back and forth.
or
Right.
like just any good that they make it like they use gas.
Well, yeah, I mean, anybody who ships this stuff is gonna care because really the quantity of shipping is down. I mean, it's just fewer people shipping stuff, right? Agreed, for sure they care. Yeah. So, yeah,
Just consumers in general who just like need to fill up their cars and stuff. Okay.
okay. Yep.
Isn't it when the price goes up, more people want to get into the drilling and stuff like that?
Okay, so some other people who are sitting around on the sidelines, not currently in the market, right? Maybe they've got some gasoline. Oh, sitting in some tanker off the Gulf of Mexico, right? And they're just hanging out with this tanker thinking, man, I've got all this money invested in it, but I can't make my money until the price goes up to X. Think anyone does that? Hell yeah, they do. Yeah, there's tankers all over the world with just gasoline in it, waiting for the price to go up or down. Really, yeah, absolutely. Or it doesn't even have to be tankers. It turns out that there's a massive storage facility for actually oil, but it's the same concept in Cushing, Oklahoma. I mean, they've got so many tanks out there of oil that it's just unbelievable. It's the size of like Columbus. Tanks of oil. It's just sitting there waiting until the price goes to a certain level and that's all it gets there, right? Why? Because it's worth it for them to hold on to this stuff, to pay for the storage of it, either sitting in a tanker out in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico or, in a, some storage tank somewhere, right? It's just worth it for them to do that until the price, so they care a lot, right? Yeah, so there are people out there who would actually profit off of actually figuring out specifically how much this is going to go up, right? Exactly that. All right, so the point there is that we want to learn about how can we do that? We can use a little bit of economics to actually figure out how it might go up. Because if you're in a business of trying to make money on moving oil, coal, natural gas, and someday solar power around, solar is exactly the same way, actually. And if you end up with storage opportunities for electricity in the future, right? I mean, Elon Musk said, there we go, that's a name you guys can all relate to, right? Elon Musk, right? Elon Musk probably thinks this way. He's like, well, shit, if I can create a storage facility for this stuff, then what I do is I just watch the grid when the price goes up and down to a certain level, then I just sell my electricity off my little storage things, right? Same concept. Okay, so you can figure this out. How are we going to figure it out? So what we're going to use is this concept of price elasticity. Price elasticity is defined as the percentage change in quantity that results from a change in price, all right? Oh, from a percentage change in price. So percentage change in quantity that results from percentage change in price. That's just the definition, right? It tells us something about the slope of this demand function, right? Price elasticity tells us something about how much the price will change given a quantity change. Alternatively, you can use it to figure out how much the quantity will change given a price change, right? So you'll find that you can go back and forth between these two concepts of quantity change and a price change. And with the elasticity, they're kind of interchangeable, actually. How do we know the price elasticity for any particular good? Well, that's where, you're going to have to rely on some other analysts because they're going to do basically regression analysis, right? They're going to create a line. Well, there's not a lot of data, right? This is where data analytics comes in. All right, so in addition to somebody who's going to use the price elasticity to figure out the price change and then to decide whether they can make a trade based on that, some other person is profiting off of their ability to take data and create a line, right, like that, which has an elasticity attached to it. So they're actually calculating the elasticity. Right? So, you're going to get the elasticity from somebody else, all right? So it turns out we know pretty well now, for many years of estimating these, the short run elasticity for gasoline is negative 0.26. So that means that I should just let that up. That was dumb. Did I draw that? 6.9. I don't need all the dots though, right? So we know that for this thing, that the elasticity, which is essentially something about the slope, equals negative 0.26. Percentage change in quantity or the percentage change in price, right? Remember, slope is what rise over run. Remember that concept. So this is change in Q, change in P, and you can put it in percentage terms, right? So that's essentially elasticity telling us something about that. That's Oh, hey, here's that thing done. You can actually figure that out. So what this means is, if the elasticity is negative 0.26, it says a 1% increase in price reduces the consumption by 0.26%. All right, so it's on here. I'm just doing it here just for, I don't know, just felt like writing stuff. I'm gonna do something up here. So percentage change in Q is what? Oh my God, percentage change in Q is 10%. So, and it goes down by 10%, right? We're trying to discover what the percentage change in price is. So we know the percentage change in price equals negative 10 divided by negative 0.26. I guess that's 38.5. So the new price is 220. So this is 220. This thing went up to, all calculated right there, 305, went up by 38.5%. So, yeah, you're gonna have to calculate this on the homework. Sorry about that. But the idea is this is actually a useful concept. If you happen to be someone who can make some money, which there are lots of people who are in the business of doing that. Okay. And as an analyst, you may at some point in the future get a chance to do that. Okay. Here's an example. Man, we just went through the 16-year anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. I decided I was going to switch this example to Hurricane Ida, but it turns out that it didn't actually have as big of an effect as Hurricane Katrina, right? Which actually really did decimate a lot of the oil production for a little while in the Gulf of Mexico. Actually, it took a lot of refineries offline. It didn't decimate so much the production because Katrina had such a huge effect on refineries, both in Louisiana and over in Texas. It actually led to a pretty big reduction, 16% reduction, in fact, in gasoline supplies in the U.S., which led to a 26% increase in gas prices, right? So, if you take what? We can figure out what the elasticity is from that, couldn't we? So, elasticity, I'm gonna need some help from somebody. Equals percentage change in quantity. That was negative 16, right? That equaled 26. We know what 16 divided by 26 is? No, it's more like this. It's more like 6.
Yeah, 0.61.
Something like that, 0.61. So the elasticity in that case was a little bit different than this negative 0.26 actually. Which is okay. Something else was probably happening in the market at that time. Causing elasticity. So that means if you were an analyst and you were using this number, you would have predicted a bigger increase in price than what was predicted here, right? So, looking back at the actual data from Hurricane Katrina, you can see how a concept like this could be super useful. At the same time, if you're actually making market decisions, you're going to have to be a little bit humble in terms of how you can sort of announce to your boss that, yeah, I think you should make this $25 million investment in something, right? Based on this elasticity number, because in fact, you can see where, your actual calculation may have been a little bit wrong. Okay.
Could you go back one slide real quick?
Yeah.
So do you add the percentage to 1 and then multiply it to the price, like for down there, the new price?
I did here to get the new price, yes.
Okay, so that's what you do for the new price?
To find the new price, yeah. So because your 220 is the original one, right? And you're adding in plus 0.385 times 220, right? And I don't know what that is, but that's 305 minus 220, so that's 85. Right? And that's how you get the 305. Okay, so you can do it in 2 steps. You could do this first, then add it to this to get this. Or you could just add the 1 to the 0.385 and do that all in 1 step to get to the price. Okay. Questions could ask, what's the change in price, right? So if the question is, what's the change in price, that would be 85 cents, right? Plus 85 cents. If it's what's the new price, then it's $3.05.
What are the time periods for short run versus?
Yeah, short run versus long. Okay, that's a great question. Typically in the gasoline market, short runs will be less than 6 months, definitely less than a year. These markets change really fast. That's not true for every single market, but for this particular market, that's true. Sort of medium run, like sort of 1 to 5 years, and longer, 5 years, maybe longer run. Okay, so price elasticity is always negative. This thing is always downward sloping the demand function. Price elasticity reflects the slope of the thing. We have 2 extra concepts that we want to understand: a principle, elastic and inelastic. Elastic means this demand curve is flatter, and it's going to have a number for elasticity that's like bigger than 1. So rather than negative 0.26, which is actually inelastic, an elastic number would be like a negative 1.26. Elastic number, sorry. So the elastic number would be a negative 1.26. Inelastic number is a negative 1.26. Ready? So inelastic means a small quantity change leads to a big price change. Okay. Well, you can see that here, right? A small change on the quantity side leads to a big change on the price side, right? Steeply sloped, inelastic. Just important to understand the concept here, right? Why is that? Okay, so what we're going to see with most energy markets, we already talked about this a little bit, is that price fluctuations are pretty rapid. What other markets have pretty rapid, big price fluctuations? Maybe you got, yeah.
Is it like airline tickets?
Airline tickets, I don't think historically have. They've actually been pretty elastic. Now, in the last year and a half, because of the pandemic, they fluctuated around. That's been more of a demand side than supply side thing. So that's a good. It is interesting. Last year and a half, they fluctuated a lot more than historically have. Yeah.
Like high tech?
High tech. Fluctuating prices. What kind of high tech do you need?
Like laptops, computers,
Laptops.
and you can find them online.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like laptops maybe don't have huge, that they just keep having a downwards and keep getting cheaper and cheaper. And what happens is the technology gets better and it encourages us to buy a better thing, right? Which is actually more expensive. Kind of a different concept. I'm not sure. I don't know if that's a good question. I don't know that sector. I have to know where it fluctuates around a lot. It's a good question. Yeah.
Housing?
It does fluctuate around a lot. It seems like recently it's just been going up and up and up. But on the other hand, historically it has fluctuated around a lot. It's very similar to the energy sector in that way. Yeah, yeah. Food, massive fluctuations in prices, especially at the commodity level, at the level that corn or soybean or cows actually. Yeah. Yep.
Like Uber prices,
Uber.
depending on how busy it is.
Uber, yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, is that the same concept? Yeah, because they have the surge pricing. They're essentially taking advantage Yeah, they're taking advantage of inelasticity and demand at that moment in time. It's absolutely right. That's actually fascinating. I've thought about that. They're kind of operating more like I mean, if anyone's really into economics, you realize that this is sort of the inelastic part of the demand function. And this is kind of the elastic part. This is way beyond what you got in this class. Just take it aside for a second. So the Uber thing. Yeah, they're kind of operating up in here on their demand function. They're taking advantage of the fact that at that particular time of day, there's a big demand and a small supply. Yeah, I think you're right on that. It's not, doesn't exist all day, though. It only exists in those periods, actually. Yeah. Yeah.
Used cars,
What was that?
used cars.
Used cars, yeah. Used cars right now. It's historically hasn't been true, though. Because used cars are just, they're a dime a dozen. In fact, what happens is the US was shipped overseas because there's just so many of them, actually. But in the last year, because, yeah, it seems like everything now that we're moving into sort of an era where everything's in short supply, actually. Kind of more stuff is kind of almost more stuff's up here in the inelastic part of the demand function. It's being forced there because we're all experiencing, look, supply has been shifted in on all of us for a lot of stuff, actually. It's interesting, actually, nowadays, we're actually in a portion of sort of demand where we haven't been before. It's good. I wouldn't have agreed with you last year or the year before, because there's always tons of used cars. Yeah, but now we're screwed. Good point. Yeah.
I think restaurant, like food prices at restaurants.
You know, food at the commodity level is far more fluctuates far more. And the reason is because food at the restaurant level, you know, the actual food that you buy, the commodity part of it is less than 5% of the actual expenditure. The rest is the labor and everything like that. So that could be like everything else that we're getting into a situation where, because labor is so hard to come by, that food prices at restaurants are starting to fluctuate more. So we're kind of getting everything going the same way now, almost, right? Because we're, you know, short supply on just about everything: labor, cars. Okay. Why is this important? Well, you know, we see in the commodity sectors that. Oh, I didn't have to raise that. Fluctuation in prices are massive. We already saw the oil price graph before. I don't think I have a graph to show you guys, but you know, we see over time the prices, you know, these massive fluctuations. Not exactly like that, right? But oil prices fluctuate up and down. So historically, things where they're inelastically demanded lead to markets where there's big fluctuations in prices, right? Leads to markets where we tend to need, we're going to talk about later, these trading concepts, right? We tend to need things like hedging, forward contracts, things like that, to help deal with the fact that there's oftentimes huge fluctuations in prices that can really affect the actors in the market, the consumers and the suppliers, right? So, you know, the reason why we study elasticity here in this class a little bit is both to understand a little bit about how the demand curves, how we can use information like elasticity to make some predictions that might be helpful for us economically. But we also study it or try to understand it because it kind of defines, in particular, energy markets has massive fluctuations in prices, and the agricultural market's the same way. So anyone who's going to say agribusiness has a degree, you should really take the commodity futures trading class because, you know, this is a market where prices fluctuate dramatically from year to year, you entry year, right? And these trading concepts can really help you as a business person potentially be more profitable. Okay. Okay, so shifts along the demand function, that's kind of what we're talking about here. Reflects a supply shock or change in the amount of supply. A reduction in supply reduces quantity. Consume prices increase, increases supply is the opposite. Price elasticity is this percentage change in quantity, consumer percentage change in price. Right? So just some summary of where we are. So that's about all we got to know. Okay. Okay, so here's a problem for you. Oh, we got time. Let's work this one out. What do you think? It's exciting. Ooh. That's what I'm talking about. Why do you want to come aboard? How about?
I don't have a good handwriting, but yeah.
It's even better. Get up here, man. Let's go. Come on. I love it. Don't get too close to me. I don't want you to give me anything. I can say that now, seriously, right? Before I could never say that. Okay. Are we gonna have them? You get your own chocolate. Hey, Thomas, did you bring the spray so I can spray the board down in the area? I'm just kidding. I'm not, I shouldn't treat you like this. Sorry about that. 16. No.
Oh, let's just see your came out.
No.
And what did it be there that?
Let's have like four quarterbacks ago. Well, come on. What are you
right,
waiting for?
no.
I mean, don't listen to me. You're working at it. I'm just kidding. Let's have them now. What do you think? Let's do it. All right. Oh, man. How are we gonna do this?
Find the percent change of the.
Let's first start out with a picture. How about that? What's your name?
Steven,
Steven. Awesome. Can you draw a picture?
yeah, I can draw a lot of pictures for you. Don't know how good they'll come out.
Oh, no, just to supply the man function.
Yeah.
Awesome. Just, there we go. Perfect. Yes, Steven. Holy smoke, look at that, across right there, one across, that's awesome. All right, so can you put the equilibrium price on there? You already got the 20 on there. Okay, can you draw a line to the left-hand axis there? What's that price?
That would be the one, that's gonna be the, no, 0.14.
0.14, all right, put the 0.14 there. And then, a million, just, I don't know, you don't have to do a million down below. You could draw, you could write a million down there for quantity, I guess. I like it. Okay, so what happens here? So the 20 wind power consumed in Ohio, what happens to it? The price of wind power falls here. Oh, no. We have to think 20 now. So the price goes down to 10 cents. There we go. You can draw that. I can't see you, but just kidding. So what's happening? Is supply going up or down?
Supply is gonna go down.
Yeah, that's technically up. You're right. Draw the new supply function. You're exactly right. That's technically up. So supply increased, right? But shifted down. I get what you're saying there. Excellent. So now put the line down to the new quantity. So we don't know what that is. That's what we got to figure out. Okay, so how are we going to do that, man? Steven, you're doing good.
We're gonna take the percent share. All right, so got.
Can't do it.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, this is good. Stop there for a second. The only thing we gotta do is you got it's percentage changes, not actual quantity changes, right?
Yeah.
But you almost got it. Don't go too far changing stuff. So the change in price, you want the percentage change in price. So how would you get the percentage change in price? So see what he did? You have 0.14 minus 1 minus point. What is that? There you go. He's doing it. That's a hard number to calculate, isn't it?
It's 0.2857.
2857. I had to write it down in advance. 28.57.
Yep.
Awesome.
I have no idea what that equals.
No, it's all right. Just write it down. A percentage change in Q equals. Yeah, maybe 1.2 times. So can you calculate that again? Maybe 1.2 times 28.57. 34.28. So that's the percentage change in quantity. Okay, and 34.28% of a million is basically 340-some thousand, right? So it's gonna go up to like 1,340,000, right?
Yeah.
All right, so that's it. Okay, good job, man. Thanks. Man. The quarterback of AEDE4320 is here. That's awesome. Okay, I like it. So it's good. So if everyone sort of follow that along, I thought it was actually pretty clear. So we had kind of a different problem here this time. We had the price change. We needed to figure out what the quantity change was. Okay. Slightly different, but we can do that with elasticity. All right. And that's basically how we would walk through it. Any questions on that? Okay, thanks. Sorry. Okay, well, I got elasticity. Good on that. Okay, there's other examples that you can work out. Any questions on it? Contact Thomas, contact me, look at the stuff online. All right. Happy to help, figure it out. Get the problem on the homework. There is a problem on the homework. It's basically like one of these, okay? So my recommendation is to try some of the problems on your own first, and then look at the answers to them. If you still don't get them, then come see Thomas and me. All right, do it before next, whatever the days that things do. All right. Because if it's the day that things do, then Thomas and I won't have enough time to help you, probably. But if you do it a couple days in advance, and you have trouble, we can definitely help. All right. So the goal on that question is that you would for sure be able to get that question correct on the homework. All right. Okay. It is a little mathematical, but I'm sorry. I said this dream that everybody's gonna be able to do this, and that they're gonna be able to use it someday. Some of you will, I can guarantee it. I mean, one of the first people to take this class is working as an energy trader up in Chicago. He doesn't use this exact thing that we did, but there are a lot of people who are really bright in this world. He's really good with numbers, so he just does this stuff in his head, right? Because literally, if you're on a trading floor, you have to be able to make decisions like that. So you get these elasticities in your head, and you can start to make these calculations pretty quickly on your own, right? Obviously, that takes lots of years of experience and effort, but certainly not something I can do, but something some people get really good at. Okay. Enough on that. The next thing is the shifts in the demand curve. The shift demand curve shifting outward or inward. That reflects something like income changes or population changes or technology changes. All right. Those are more interesting to think about, really. So here's all the stuff that causes a shift in demand for energy. It could be more stuff than this, right? So population growth, boom. Income growth, boom. We go up and down. Could change both the stuff that we consume and could change the type of energy that we actually consume. All right, income changes. What do you think is more important, income change or population change? Yeah.
Income,
Yeah, why?
you said higher income, like as people go from the lower class to the middle class, they consume a lot more energy than the middle class to upper class, because they have more money in their pockets, they can afford more stuff that has energy and then use it.
Yeah. Yeah, so it just seems like, and most data historically is consistent with the idea that decreases in income have had a far bigger effect on energy consumption than increases in people. And one reason is because a lot of the increase in people that's happened historically over time has often happened in places that are poor in general. So as those places that increase people, because they don't have income, they don't consume dramatically bigger amounts of energy. Right? And kind of now we're in a world where, we're thinking that maybe we're not going to get a whole lot more people. We will get some more people, but the real issue is what happens when all the people who do have decide to have bigger incomes. So decide that get bigger income as a result of economic growth. So income is probably far more important. Other things that can affect the demand for energy are technology. That can have both a positive or negative effect on energy consumption. As we get new technologies, these technologies tend to potentially increase our demand for energy. Although some of the technologies could reduce how much energy we consume. Smart meters, something like that ultimately could reduce the amount of energy we consume. We get better off with, how we consume stuff because we can actually see when we're consuming too much and when we're not. All right, conservation, something that's kind of coming along and having an effect on energy consumption. And that typically would just drive energy consumption down. Migration, it turns out, is having important effects on energy consumption. The effect of migration is largely the fact we're mostly moving to cities. That's typically what has happened in the last century and a half, 2 centuries. As this second agricultural revolution is taking hold, and we're getting so much more food production per hectare to allow people to move into cities, and massive urbanization actually helps us from an energy perspective, actually. All right, so I'm going to talk about each of these a little bit more and look at what these things, how they affect the consumption of energy. All right, so population growth. All right, so we've had a huge concern about population growth historically, right? The issue there is that probably it's not as important now as it used to be. Why is that? Why is that? Why is it that in the 70s we were just scared to death that population was going to explode? And apparently it did. I mean, a lot more people between the 60s and 70s and today. But today we're not so worried about it.
Back when the population bomb was written, they were worried about being able to produce food for everybody. But there have been such great increases in efficiency of farmland that it didn't end up happening.
Okay, so yes, one concern I had that was with the big increase in population, we weren't going to have enough land, right, to feed all the people. But we got big increases in production per hectare in a sense, right, per acre. Okay. Okay, so we've gotten better at supplying really important stuff we need, like food. Okay, one thing maybe is reduce our concern, yeah.
Aren't like all the projections now saying that like the population's gonna level off at like 11 billion or something like that?
Yes, why is that?
I think it was like taken from like trends of like how fast that countries are, I don't want to say industrializing, but like getting more advanced, and the more income grows and the more advanced countries get, the more access they have to contraceptives, and generally the less they need like more children, because there's not gonna be as many people doing like farm work where they need like the free labor from their kids and stuff like that.
Okay, so what's happening? Yeah, what's that called? What's this thing that's happening that's causing population growth to really slow down? Global
Development.
Okay, development is maybe a process contributing to it, maybe.
Isn't it called like the demographic transition?
It's
It's like the
demographic
stages.
transition. You guys all heard of the demographic transition? I don't know if you've heard of it or not. We're going to talk about it just for a second. All right, so this demographic is amazing. It's amazing stuff, really. We're not going to become demographers in this file. Take a second here, because it is interesting, this demographic transition. This is a pretty powerful graph. It really explains a lot. A lot of this process, what's your name?
Jason.
Jason sort of was talking about. I mean, it's a lot. You just had some things. There's a lot more to it than that. But that's just like what I say. Everything I say is a lot more to it than that for sure. So my kids tell me that all the time. Anyways, what's happening here? All right, look at this. Birth rates and death rates, 2 things that affect population pretty clearly, right? The demographic transition sort of hypothesizes that death rates fall first. That's the first thing that happens. So population is just sort of going along. And the first thing that happens that causes population increases, the death rate declines, all right? So one thing that could be causing the death rate to decline has nothing to do with contraceptives or any of these other things, but just with the fact that we're better at medical stuff. Oh, back in the old days is that we just had more food, right? Back in the 1800s, it's just that, well, heck, we could actually produce food now pretty effectively, right? So, and we got better nutrition. Better nutrition was originally really important and actually helped people have lower death rates, right? So the first thing in demographic transition is death rates fall. The second thing is birth rates fall. That's when all the sort of contraceptives, all these other things come in, right? Both that as well as stuff like, oh, well, like antibiotics. What are these? What else do we use like antibiotics? I don't know. Vaccines? Something like that. Ivermectin. Yeah, that's right. Sorry, just a joke. Whatever. Shouldn't joke. Sorry about that. Okay. After the death rates fall, the birth rates start to fall. Okay, so the point is that this demographic transition is now been observed pretty much everywhere in the world. It happened. That the big population bomb that we saw, we thought we saw in the 70s and 80s, did see it was really there, was going on, was happening for a reason. It was happening because death rates were falling. And ultimately, it takes a while for birth rates to start falling and get back in line with this big decline in death rates. But once you've been through that, you'll end up at a point where both death rates and birth rates are lower and at roughly equal levels. And this has happened in virtually every country that's moved from relatively low income to higher income. It's happening in a massive way in China right now. India, you pretty much name it, pretty much every country in the world has gone through it and is pretty far along with demographic transition. There's a few countries in Africa that aren't. But there are most places in the world that have gone through this demographic transition. So the demographers are now saying, we're not going to see a lot more population growth, right? Human fertility has declined dramatically. At the end of this, right, what we see is, birth rates and death rates such that the average sort of, if you're gonna have a stable population, the average sort of number of births per person or per female is going to be around 2, something like that, right? And we see that in many countries that the fertility rate is sort of around 2, oftentimes less than that in many developed countries. Okay, so population growth is slowing pretty much everywhere, still kind of really rapid and increasing a bit in Africa, but slowing in most places. The projections are that we may get between sort of 9 and 10 million, between 9 and 10 billion total people on Earth. We're about 7.2 right now, something like that. So most of the projections from the UN suggest that we're going to be in this kind of world, right? Not a huge increase in people over the next 20 to 40 years. And that most of that is a function of what we're going to call demographic momentum. That is that as we move, really just kind of in here, there's some momentum that you're not going to get to zero growth right away. So most of this increase is really just demographic momentum. Can't do anything about it, it's going to happen. So we'll end up with more people, but we're not going to end up with twice as many people as we have right now, probably. Okay, so we can take that and we can assume constant use of energy per person and make a projection for how much energy we're going to need in the future. So we know how many exajoules we're using today based on the BP report, and we can just pretty simply project that forward and say that maybe we need about 33% in this sort of medium case, which is really kind of a high case now, what we think we're really going to have in terms of people. So it turns out the population likely isn't going to have a huge effect on increasing the overall demand for energy. All right. Maybe we would need about 33% more. And I would bet if we were living in a world where we only need 33% more energy, we wouldn't be worried so much about where we're going to get our energy from, right? I wouldn't be, because that doesn't seem like such a big ask, right? It really doesn't. We just need 33% more. Okay? But that's not really the world we're in, because income growth has been just growing exponentially for quite a long time and is going to continue probably growing exponentially for quite a long time. Income's distributed unequally. The biggest growth in income is in places that have the least amount of income right now. And it turns out that that can have a really big effect on the amount of energy in the air. So it's important to sort of keep track of that. The income implications of this income growth are pretty big. And whoever mentioned it before, is growth of the middle class is huge, right? You can think of a place like China where we've grown this middle class by dramatic amounts in the last 2 to 3 decades, basically taken place the size of the US in terms of people and created a middle class that big, right? So we're like 300 million people in the US, right? We have a middle class of 200 million, something like that, right? I mean, China just created a middle class of more than that number of people in the last couple of decades, man. Phenomenal, right? So huge increase in energy consumption as a result of that. Their energy intensity per capita has grown dramatically. Their population didn't grow that much. It did grow, but it didn't grow that much, right? They went from something like 900 million people to 1.2 billion people. So they increased by maybe a third, but the incomes went up dramatically, right? And so their energy consumption went from way down here, 0.05 per person to sort of 0.2. So you multiply that by 1.2 people, that's a lot of big increase in energy, right? So, the idea here is that income growth is just critically more important than population growth in terms of defining how much energy we're going to need in the future. A lot of it has to do with this technology adoption curve idea. So if you've taken the innovations class or any class on innovations, I guess adoption of new innovations, you will have seen things like these S curves. We sort of explain it. Have sort of low levels of adoption at first, then higher levels. Well, this is kind of looking at it across annual income, essentially. So with a lot of these sort of technologies, we see that low levels of income, we have low levels of adoption. As we get to higher levels of income, we get the higher levels of adoption. This happens to be for vehicles and refrigerators in Mexico. I'm just presenting this data from that from Wolfram. He's a really good sort of energy economist. So showing, if you're, the point is you're moving people from a relatively low income to a high income, what they're going to do is all of a sudden no refrigerators to having refrigerators, right? That's a big increase in your household consumption of electricity. It's a huge increase actually, right? Same thing about cars, went from no cars to cars that your family happens to be one that's getting more income. So this idea that moving from into the middle class has a really big effect on the amount of energy that's going to be consumed. Really critically important. So richer countries, kind of maybe are going the other way. We kind of see that in some of the data. That as richer countries, as people get to the top end, and we get more and more wealth, we start to see conservation becoming more important. People kind of moving past the edge of consuming more and more energy intensive stuff. So we're starting to see some data on that. You can kind of see that in this data, which is kind of millions of exajoules per dollar GDP. Dollar GDP is basically an accounting of income. Yep.
What are cafe standards?
Oh, I had that on the other slide or something?
It's not that.
It's on this one? Yeah, cafe standards. Yeah, cafe standards, or what are they? Corporate auto fuel efficiency standards. So these are things that govern the fuel efficiency of automobiles that use gasoline. And the idea there is just it's only high income countries that have put things like cafe standards in place. So the US has cafe standards, we put them in place in the 1970s when the energy crisis started. We had really high oil prices and we had really shitty cars. And here was the deal, right? The issue in the 1970s, this is kind of a fascinating story. And that's always getting off on the tangent. This is actually really interesting. So in the 1970s, your gasoline prices tripled overnight, right? 1973, and then 79 again. I mean, the US had always had lots of energy, lots of oil. Yeah.
Just when Jimmy Carter was president.
No. The second time it was when Jimmy Carter. The first time was when Nixon was president, and then Ford. And we had the famous with inflation now thing, right? I mean, Ford was just a crappy president. Why was Ford such a shitty, crappy president? Why? You guys know, because he was a former president of the University of Michigan. I mean, come on. Yeah, okay. Whatever. He was. Oh yeah, high oil prices. Yeah, back when Nixon for. Carter was a recipient. We'll talk a lot more about that. So oil prices went up, gasoline prices went up. The US was in a vulnerable place. Why? Because we had automobile technology, which was really inefficient cars. Why was that? Because we had a lot of it at low prices, right? Just it's economically what you would expect. All of a sudden, overnight, prices went up dramatically. Gas lines, right? The rationing gasoline. Right now, some countries ration gasoline and ration your days to be able to go out on the roads because you have too many cars on the roads, right? So China does that. In Beijing, they've got a system for where people with certain license plate numbers can go out on certain days. Has nothing to do with gasoline, has just to do with too much congestion. Well, we had that back in the 70s. I mean, you had certain even license plate numbers could go out and get gas, could drive on the road on Tuesdays, or even days, and the other numbers could go out on odd days, right? Literally, we did that. We were, US was actually for a time no different than a communist country, actually, right? You can make a argument for that. All right, so the point was, we had this terrible technology of cars. Somebody else had really good technology for cars. Who was that?
Japan.
Yeah, so Japan had these cars, right? These cars that got great gas mileage. Okay, they actually got like 5 times the gas mileage than most American cars. So what happened in the 1970s? Gas prices go up. US manufacturers, what's their problem? They're down, right? They're down because they can't compete with Japan. All of a sudden, everybody in America is like, why do I want this piece of crap Cadillac, right? That gets 3 miles per gallon when I can get this Toyota that gets 8 miles per gallon, which literally that's what it got back then, but it was better than 3, right? So everybody just was starting to switch over. So what happens then? I mean, this is how regulations get through, right? The gas manufacturer I should say gasoline farming manufacturer, like Ford, Chrysler, whoever, right? What do you do? Well, you want to get cars that can compete with it, right? But what do you really want to do?
Limit imports.
You want to limit imports, maybe, if you can, right? What else?
More gas,
Get what?
get more gas.
Get more oil and drive prices down since back the old days, right? Yeah, you'd love to do that. They could, that's right, they did want to do that, yeah. What you really want to try to level the playing field as much as you can, get everybody to have the same set of rules, right? So, what the automobile manufacturers in the US really pushed for at the time were these CAFE standards, right? Because what they wanted, what they knew is if they couldn't at the time compete with Japan, they weren't inherently, or Japanese cars, they weren't inherently afraid of competing with them over time. But it's a matter of how do we get there, right? So yeah, so at the time, there was a whole set of negotiations with Congress and the president at the time to sort of start to implement these CAFE standards, which would put a set of standard regulations that said that each corporation had to have an average auto fleet fuel efficiency standard at the end of the year of X. Over time, they would start in the late 1970s, basically. And in exchange, they got some redress through some import restrictions, things like that, that helped the automobile manufacturers in the US get through this sort of critical period when they didn't have that technology, right? They weren't afraid that they couldn't make the technology. They knew they could, they just couldn't do it tonight. Today, they needed 5 years. So, that's how regulations like that get in place. And it's actually exactly why this is so fascinating, because it's freaking deja vu. Trump comes along, so Obama went and just jacked these things up at 50-some miles per gallon. Every manufacturer in the world decides to just completely take their sailing ship of manufacturing, convert it over to meet this new standard. And along comes Trump and he just ditches it overnight, right? It was fascinating because the entire automobile industry in the US was like, no, don't ditch that, right? We don't actually want that ditch, because all of a sudden that means that they could have new competitors who would come in and actually create some of these cars with shitty gas mileage to compete with, right? They need everybody to play by the same rules, right? So it's kind of fascinating that even though they did it anyways, all manufacturing companies of automobiles in the US were actually not in favor at all of the Trump administration of getting rid of the CAFE or reducing the CAFE standard when they did it in whatever 20. Oh, so CAFE standards gone. I mean, they're the kinds of things that only rich countries do, though. Poorer countries don't have the sort of manufacturing wherewithal, but they also, they just, you just got to take whatever car you can get, right? You can't really choose which kinds of cars you can sell. All right. So we can start to see that this energy use per capita versus income per capita. So income per capita, that's income per person. Over here, energy use per person on the left-hand side. We can start to see that your richer countries have a kind of a different relationship than less well-off countries, right? So over here, as income's rising, we can see this concept that energy consumption per person is rising as well, right? That's the idea that you're in the middle class, you gotta buy more stuff that uses energy. If you're relatively more well-off, you're sort of, the next thing you buy, it still uses energy, it's probably better at using energy than the last thing, right? Okay. So we can really actually see this concept in the data. Anybody know what that concept's called? See this Kuznets curve, environmental Kuznets curve, you've ever heard that on the classes. So this is basically all this is the environmental Kuznets curve, right? So think of a y-axis being, say, diminished environmental quality, x-axis being income, GDP per capita. So as we're growing our income, we're not going to be so worried about the environment. And we're going to have consumption of consume things that tend to be more damaging to the environment. We're going to experience diminished environmental quality. And at some point, we'll sort of turn the corner and start going the other direction.
So really high on the y-axis is like really bad environment.
Yep. So this would be, many countries have sort of be in here right now, sort of moving up this direction. So you think like China, like 5 years ago, China might be here. Right, air quality was horrendous, water quality was terrible. They may not have improved, so they started actually changing. Yeah, does this apply to individuals or countries? That's a great question in economics. I don't think we're certain in economics. It might apply to individuals too. We only have data to confirm it for countries or units of organizations, which is also shown across states in the US. But we don't really kind of show this across individual consumption decisions at different. Here's just some data on for energy. This is turning point, which would be the level of income. With this turning point for just energy in general, it's about 36 to 37,000. This is actually for, I think I put that $2010. So you can compare that relative to 2010 income levels. And that's 10 years ago. Probably the average income in the US was probably $47,000 to $50,000 at that time. So yeah.
Okay, so this makes sense. This makes complete sense, like within the borders of an actual country, and especially like now with new technology and knowledge, China was able to go through this curve much faster than like the United States or whatever, for various other reasons too. But like, I guess my only problem that I've had with this, again, I took 2,500 spring semester, fall semester last year, is that like, your total overall environmental damage is going to be like much greater than when you started out, just because of like population growth and all of the, natural resources it takes to build the energy systems. And like short relative to previous, relative to like the worst part, it's going to be cleaner in the country, but like the overall global natural resource destruction is going to be, because we just ship our recyclables off to China, or it used to be China, and now we just kind of like take our trash and it's not in the United States.
So this is a good point. So this figure, when we have estimated, and economists and lots of others have estimated, not just economists sort of doing this, have only done it for the country, right? And they don't account for the fact that we may ship production of dirty goods to other countries, right? So the US purchasing a lot of, industrial goods and manufacturing goods for the last 40 years or 30 years from China, for instance, shipped a lot of its environmental pollution to say, for example, to China, right? And that's not accounted for in this, absolutely. Agreed. So there's limitations to some extent with this model, it can only apply to certain. It's a nice, I like to think of it as a heuristic way to think about it. And, for sure, it does reflect the fact that probably in the US, people do value the environment more now than they did before. However, there's limitations to that because many people who value the environment more may not be taking into consideration the effect that, people, for example, in a sustainability degree might be taking into account, which is that, well, actually, I want to understand the effects, the environmental effects of the stuff I consume, whether it's produced here or somewhere else, right? And that's a good point.
I'm glad I cleared that up because I've been wondering about that in the back of my head for like
Yeah.
months.
Yeah, and the data we have for this, it's hard to actually make that other calculation because, the trade flows are always reported in dollar amounts rather than in quantity amounts globally, so it's very difficult to actually measure this as well, if you account for all that.
Yeah, it's kind of like, so, we used to ship our trash to China, but then China is like, well, now we're the next United States, so we don't want your trash anymore, so they're just gonna ship the trash to, like, now we're shipping it to like Malaysia, but then what happens when like Malaysia gets, big enough, and they're just gonna ship it somewhere else, and it's gonna just like keep going down the line,
That's
and then at some point gradually we'll have more like, be able to figure out how to profitably recycle or like, just, I don't even know, like, use the raw materials for something else, I don't know. It's gotta end somewhere, unless, I don't know.
Correct, so, yeah, we don't talk a lot about that in this class, but it's a good point in this particular thing. One note about Malaysia, actually, Malaysia has pretty high income per capita.
What?
Malaysia has pretty high income per capita.
Oh, I thought we were shipping it to, our recyclables to Malaysia now, instead of China.
Maybe through Malaysia, probably not through Malaysia.
Oh,
Malaysia is an interesting case. Anyways, another concept, we're not gonna do calculations on income like this. Yay, give me some credit, right? We're only asked for some calculations. Why don't we do a few calculations here for you guys to see, just to see, okay? Because it's a useful thing. You may use it, some of you may use it, some of you may not. You're not gonna be required to do this. I mean, this concept of the environmental acuteness curve is kind of built on the concept of income elasticity. So it's, it's the same thing as price elasticities. The percentage change in consumption resulting from a given percentage change in income. It can be positive or negative. So price elasticity of demand can only be negative, but this can be positive or negative. Two definitions. I'll be using these terms from time to time. That's why I'm defining them here. I am with 100% probability never going to ask you on a test to define these two terms. But you will hear me use them, so now you know what the definition of it is, all right? So normal good just simply means, it means that the income elasticity is positive, right? So it just means that if you have an increase in income, you'll buy more of the stuff, all right? That's all normal good means. Is that right? This is where I can test our gratitude to make sure they remember something. Yeah. If it's an inferior good, it means that if the income goes up, you may end up actually reducing the consumption. Okay. So, we're actually, if you go back and you think about that graph that showed, should I go back? I'm not dumb. Actually, you guys think I'm dumb. My kids have to think I'm dumb. Actually, I am dumb.
we're all done.
Don't respond to that, though, okay? So this is kind of means that when we plot out US states energy consumption versus income per capita here, BTUs, form of energy, that's like exajoules per capita per person over there, downward sloping. It's kind of indicating as our income goes up, we're actually consuming less energy, right, per person. That means maybe in the US, we're at a point where energy itself, is an inferior good, okay? So we've kind of achieved, gone over the side of that Kuznets curve, we got to the point where we actually, as we get more income, consume a little bit less energy. Right, so it's interesting. Most countries aren't there, right? Most countries, if we look back here, kind of over here, where as income goes up, they have a positive income elasticity. Make sense, this concept, income elasticity, all right? So this is kind of reflective of negative, this is kind of reflective of positive, this is reflective of being an inferior good now in these places, and the normal good in other places, all right? Okay. Typical income elasticity for energy is typically estimated to be positive on average for the world, somewhere between 0.4 and 0.6. It's not true for the country. Just sort of showed, which is kind of an average. Yeah.
Can you explain the normal good really quickly again?
Yeah. So
Or
normal
break
good
down
is
the numbers that were on there.
yeah. So the normal good is a good for which if there's an increase in income, we will observe a proportionate increase in consumption.
Oh, okay, that's easy.
Okay, so it's like saying you as a college student, our dream at Ohio State is that you're a college student today, and 2 years from now, or 3 years from now, whenever the hell you're gonna graduate, you're not gonna be a college student, you're gonna have a job, okay? And your income is gonna go up. So that would mean that whatever it is, when your income goes up, you buy a lot of stuff, that means you're gonna use a lot of stuff, that means you're gonna consume more energy. Okay, so your income went up, your consumption of energy went up. All right. Proportionate is the percentage increase in consumption. However, me, I'm sitting here, I've got this dream that my kids are gonna get out of high school and go to college and get the hell out of my house. I'm gonna say all kinds of bad stuff about my kids. I really love this stuff. They're very good. I'll always, unfortunately, thank God they don't see these things. Maybe they will, I don't know. Okay. Love you guys. Okay. Anyways, when they go away, my energy consumption is going way down. So my income's going up, my energy consumption is going down. Right? Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So what's the difference between necessary and luxury, and like what's the point, I guess, like the threshold?
Yeah. So a necessary good is these are just terms in economics, anywhere from 0 to basically something really big. Is a good that just it's necessary. So that as our income goes up, we need to have more. So food is kind of like a necessary good in a sense. I'm just trying to think of what other necessary goods are really out there.
I think an example that one of my econ teachers gave was like necessary is the equivalent of like a cheeseburger, and luxury is like the equivalent of a steak or something.
Well, it's definitely, so yeah, I mean, that's a good way to think of it in terms of food, types of food, good food. Yeah, you can think of it like different types of cars, right? There's, I mean, I drive a Honda Accord. That's maybe a necessary. I don't know. Maybe not. My neighbor down the street has a couple of Beamers and things like that. Those may be luxuries. I don't know.
Okay.
So proportionately, what happens is that if income goes up, then we consume disproportionately more. The luxury goods are things we consume disproportionately more as our income goes up. Right?
Okay. That makes sense.
So my friend on the street is a real doctor, right? They make actual money. So.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay, so we're gonna end it there. You have everything you need for homework. All right, we're gonna take a little detour next week to Bruce. We gotta come back to this. You got everything you need for the homework, all right? Thanks, Stephen. What's your name, Stephen?
Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. Grab this first, I'll always forget it. You know how many times I had to run back in here and grab a stupid thing. Sure.
The last question. Like,